Hello, everyone. It's Regular Guy here, and I want to try something a little bit different today. In other videos I've recorded, I've read through old texts kind of slowly and then tried to explain things as best I can uh, in my own words, offer my own interpretation of things. And really, there's no good way to do that with this. With this author, just given the time constraints I'm working with, and really, I think given the attention of anyone watching this video. So what I'm going to do instead today is read through some notes that I cribbed in the margins, and kind of see where they take us. Okay, I don't know myself. I just took these notes as I went along, and I tried to make sense of what the text said. So what I'm going to do is read my notes, and then I'll just let you read the text for yourself while the screen is there. And I think maybe that's the best way to do it. And I'll just make references to the text here or there. Now, the author we're reading is this guy, Samuel Pufendorf. I've mentioned him in a few other videos. I won't bother with a biography in this video. I'll just say that this book, these 18 pages come out of this book of his, which is probably his most famous book. Now he's talking about some of the same themes that Locke was talking about, in my videos on Locke. All right, so let's get back to my notes. My notes are in the margins here. They're just on the side. All right. So the first thing I put in here is that Pufendorf owned a lot of books. As I was reading this, I started highlighting authors who wasn't familiar with. And there were some areas where I just kind of went off the chain and started highlighting like whole, passages that Pufendorf cites in the footnotes just because I thought they were really interesting. Um, I'm astounded at how well read Pufendorf was, for any time, for any era, let alone his era. Which was roughly the same time as Locke. He was a contemporary of Locke, writing at around the same time. Okay, here, what's a false display of externals? And I say, how much does this resemble Filmer's belief that humans naturally fall into hierarchies? Okay, so Pufendorf here I'll explain his style, okay? He's kind of slowly walking us into some really harsh truths. His style, I guess, is to proceed gently, okay, and to kind of make you think that you know he just takes you in baby steps through this, okay. So when he first starts talking about human nature, he talks about it in the context of people telling jokes. I mean, literally, like a stand-up comic or Saturday Night Live kind of situation here. Uh, this isn't any kind of situation where people you would, this is low intensity, let's say, conflict that he's describing here. Okay, he says that even when people make jokes, they have to be at someone else's expense, okay? Um, like if Jerry Seinfeld is saying, why do they drive on the parkway and park on the driveway? He's making fun of the people who, invented the English language, basically. But he's also putting himself above them in sort of an intellectual hierarchy. And then the audience is also doing the same thing when they laugh, okay? They're sorting themselves, he's saying, into hierarchies. And he's very much like I guess Filmer, may have been in the way that Locke characterized him as saying that, man is naturally hierarchical. But Pufendorf is talking about some more fundamental stuff here. He's just using this as an illustration about when he talks about what happens when people laugh, okay? He says that this tendency that we have to sort ourselves into hierarchies, it happens even in these high intellectual circles. And you can't get rid of it, okay? There's no sort of discipline or punishment you can inflict on somebody that'll um, put an end to this desire they have. I'll point out too that Pufendorf was aware that this was happening even when people were making racist jokes, right? Pufendorf is nothing like Locke. It's nothing like Locke. Um, you know, he's very ahead of his time. I put in the margins here. Do people join the Sierra Club out of a desire for glory? The reason I put that here is because Pufendorf up here looks at all these authors that have written about, sort of state of nature stuff and why people form states. And he says that, they all seem to agree that people form states for self interested reasons. That everything that people do is fundamentally self interested. And he's pointing that out when he's talking about the humor here. He says that these people who are laughing, they're all laughing for self interested reasons. They're laughing because Jerry Seinfeld's joke helps them feel naturally superior to someone else. Okay. So it's self interest that drives people into societies. He says all these people agree on that. But then he says, okay, if it's self interest, what kind of self interest is it? Is it the self interest driven by need? Like, are people forming states because they need, it's just a necessity of our existence? Or is it out of desire for glory? Now that's kind of weird, okay? Glory. Like, what does that even mean? Okay. So it's here, do people join the Sierra Club out of desire for glory? Now, I ask that question because he says this desire for glory, he sees it operating anytime people form voluntary associations. Okay. Um, and up here I talk somewhere else I talk about false display of externals. Okay. Maybe that's what glory is, okay? False display of externals. Um, and I ask here, why does anyone join the Sierra Club? I think I'm trying to pick organizations that seem like they're totally unobjectionable. Organizations that seem fairly uncontroversial, because Pufendorf is talking about this instinct for glory and putting on false displays of virtue. He sees this happening even with when people form these voluntary associations, that are much less organized than states. Okay, so the whole time the Pufendorf is writing this, um, he's keenly aware that there are people who don't live in states. There are hunter-gatherer societies out there, and so he's aware that people can exist in at different levels of organization. Okay, but he's saying here when he talks about states specifically, okay, is what he's concerned about in this passage that I've selected. But he talks about all voluntary associations, every voluntary association. Okay, um, basically anything larger than a family is it due to need or for glory. Now, this stuff about glory here, he talks about a lot of it having to do with um, uh, how to put it. You seeking recognition from others. Okay, in other words, glory is only worth something if other people recognize it. Okay, now I think he says glory because he's thinking about people at their most base nature, and he may be thinking about the Iliad and the Odyssey. Pufendorf wasn't so hung up on the Bible, but if you read the Iliad, it's obvious that whoever wrote that and whoever was meant to be the audience for that book um, put a high value on glory, okay, which is not something that we value highly maybe today, okay. But other philosophers have pointed out that it was valued highly in these ancient, let's call them primitive societies, okay. So is it about necessity or is it about one of these more base instincts that we'll just call glory, okay. So that's really what he's talking about here. Now, I put how do economists define wealth? Economists define wealth as just pretty much anything you want. Okay, if anything that makes you happy. Okay, if owning an iPhone makes you happy, then you can measure wealth in terms of iPhone ownership. There's all kinds of ways you can measure it. Okay, money is an easy proxy for measuring wealth, but wealth can be measured. Some people might prefer. Um, it might measure wealth in terms of the free time they have to sit around and read books like this. And so, economists will accept that as a measure of wealth, okay, depending on, what concept or what phenomenon it is they're trying to explain. But in any case, um, Pufendorf says here, therefore, every society is entered into either for the sake of advantage or of glory. So he puts sake of advantage, okay, which is maybe a little different from need, okay. Um, Now I put this, you didn't build that. I didn't put that as in there to poke fun at Obama. I actually think that Obama was right. I thought he was making a valid point there about that. Pufendorf makes the same point here. Um, Anyone trying to boast about their accomplishments, okay, first of all, needs an audience that's going to recognize his accomplishments. Okay, if you you know own a lot of big fancy buildings and you have your own private jet, and hotels and stuff, and you want people to respect you for that. Well, there have to be people who around who will actually respect that stuff. Like if you can't go out in the woods and ask an animal to respect that, and so I mean, that necessity exists even before you start like building the hotels and all that. And that's setting aside the fact that you needed other people to help you get that. Nobody does these great things by themselves, okay? That's something he's pointing out. So again, we're talking about things that, is this maybe a reason why people form states, okay, so that they can do all this great stuff. All right. Now, here, this is kind of crazy, a little creepy, but hard to argue with, okay? He's saying, look, for anything that we might do, like say pick a fruit off a tree, pick an apple off a tree, okay? Something that simple, just because we're hungry. Anything that involves any level of effort. We'd always prefer to have another person do that work for us. It would always be our preference to do nothing and just have another person at our command who can just act on our behalf and just do things for us and just go fetch things for us. That's always that any if we're anytime we're doing something else, like anytime we're doing work by ourselves or anytime we're hiring someone to do work for us or anytime we're asking someone to do a favor for us, that's our second option or a third or fourth. It's not our first option. Our first choice. I mean, sorry, I shouldn't say option. I should say choice. It's our second choice or third or fourth choice. Our first choice would always be to have a slave, basically, that we could command, okay, cost free. Now, that's kind of a harsh thing to say, to anyone. But it's true that people do value convenience and they do want things to be automated and they do want, people are investing in AI and all this kind of stuff. So it's true that people do, in a sense, want that kind of convenience. They do seek that out, okay, and they prefer to avoid doing work, okay. So he's pointing this out as a possible, at least a benefit that people get from coming together and forming states. Okay, now he hasn't talked yet about really what he thinks is the real cause of states. Okay, here he talks about this guy, Arian and Epictetus. The Wikipedia entry on it I thought was real neat. I put the whole thing in green because I just thought it looked cool and I want to go read more about it later. Here he talks about here I'm ripping on Locke. I'm still mad. When I read Locke, I just finished reading like Pufendorf, and one of the reasons I got so fed up with Locke, you know, and still to this day kind of have a hard feelings about Locke is that he was so much harder to read than Pufendorf, and I couldn't resist as I was reading at this to look for examples to either align with Locke here and there. Um, but other ways in which he contradicts Locke. And Pufendorf didn't think we had a duty to form a government like Locke did. He didn't think it was inevitable. Remember, he knew that hunter-gatherer societies existed. Pufendorf also noticed that it takes a long time to raise children, human children, and that they really require a lot of socialization in order to be brought into any kind of a civilized state and to become loyal to the state. Okay? To take a child Children, you just throw them out in the woods. They don't care about the United States or France or Canada or whatever country. If you want to convince a kid that, you're Australian or you're Norwegian or you're whatever, you have to, it takes a lot of effort. It takes a long time to explain this to a kid what that means. It takes a long time. All right. Um, he doesn't say it requires brainwashing, but you could look at it that way. And but it's still it's a long, slow process either way. Okay. Um, he brings in Aristotle to back him up. He brings in all kinds of ancient authors. It's just incredible. Who I don't even know who this is. I mean, to even this Pufendorf's library must have been just insane. Um, he talks about speech. Now, what he says about speech here aligns with what we know about, the origins of speech today. Um, you know, we know, I think, that speech had to evolve in humans before the first settled societies existed, probably well before they existed. There's all kinds of debates about whether different certain species of early hominids had the capability for speech, but it's pretty clear that that capability existed well before states formed. Okay, Pufendorf recognizes that too, and he's saying, look, speech facilitates a kind of socialization that seems unique to humans, but it's also socialization. Like humans were allowed to live long, happy lives socializing with each other without states for a long time. And his sort of reverse engineering of speech, okay, the evolution of speech is how he arrives at that conclusion. He's right. He's just right. I mean, Pufendorf, everything he says here is pretty much consistent with our scientific understanding of things today. Okay. um let's see. Yeah, okay, he talks about these ancient Persians here. um these ancient Persians, here, they're really loyal to their king. Okay, they have this custom where a person sacrificing makes his vows not for himself only and his own, but prays for all the Persians and especially for the king. All right, he says, "Hey, I'm gonna take Herodotus here at his word for it. Assume that that's true. Let's all assume that ancient Persians were like that. We still gotta take notice that like really nobody that we know is like that. Okay, like the average person doesn't give a damn about the state. Okay, doesn't have any real loyalty to it. Okay, uh it's fake, basically. I mean, he talks up here about loyalty to the state, about false display of values. Talks about people seeking glory and how states seem to facilitate that. Okay, talks about like kids having to be brainwashed. Okay, talks about these states not really being natural, speech, this thing. And then you get down here and he's saying like it's we all just kind of know it's BS, like that's what made these ancient Persians so remarkable, right? If this were normal behavior, Herodotus wouldn't have bothered to make note of it, and we wouldn't still be talking about it here, 2,000 years later. Okay, now I've highlighted a lot of stuff about fear. We'll get to that. Now, here he's talking about, what separates humans from animals. Now, I got to say, Pufendorf, again, very different from Locke, okay? Locke, if you watch those videos or if you read Locke, you'll notice that he really thinks that animals are just put out there for us to eat. And he thinks that's all we're supposed to do is go eat those things. Find a way to make more animals, but only so we can eat them. He doesn't give a damn about the animals. Okay. The only thing he notices about them is that they run away from us. They don't naturally submit to us. Naturally, the rabbits don't just run up to Adam and jump into his arms or jump into the pot. Now, Pufendorf, here says, look, animals, um, pretty noble creatures, frankly, way more noble than we are. Okay. Um, says, you know, no animal is more fierce and uncontrolled than man, more prone to vices which are calculated to disturb the peace of society. It's like, animals don't really have some of the sick appetites that humans seem to have. Humans can be really depraved. Animals really just kind of follow Locke's command. They just take what they need to eat and they don't take any more than they need. They leave enough for their neighbor's share. Um, he says some are driven by their lust, but just, at certain times of the year. He says, humans, they're like that 24/7, 365. These other animals, like they control their urges. Humans just have all kinds of crazy urges that take them in insane directions. He says animals treat each other better than we treat each other. He says by and large, two animals of the same species tend not to fight each other. They tend to accord each other some level of respect that we just don't accord to each other. Instead, he says, we obtain a desire for superfluous things we don't need. We're different than the animals out there because we have a thirst, we have a desire for things that those animals don't desire, don't care about. We want a crown with jewels. We want to own our own jet. We want to become president. We want to own a car company, whatever. Animals don't have that. And here he calls ambition the most baneful of evils. Okay. I put in the margins, only humans go to war over superfluous things. That's true. He's saying other animals don't fight, they don't kill each other like we do. Okay. He talks here about humans having vivid memories of injuries and yearning for revenge. You know, like, yeah, people sitting around with these collective memories of injuries trying to get revenge. He's like, only humans do that. Animals don't do that. Okay. Um, he talks about tragedy of the commons down here. Locke, you read 800 pages or whatever, to finally get to the section where Locke sorts out the tragedy of the commons and he comes up with a market based solution to it. Pufendorf, it looks like, had already come up with those same ideas in his head and also figured out what the limits of that, of Locke's solutions are, and then just kind of flushes them down the toilet in like one paragraph. Okay. Um, Locke solves the tragedy of commons by telling the readers to go out to the Americas because there's so much land out there that you can just grab. There's no need to compete because there's just free land you can grab. He doesn't give a damn about the people who are living in the Americas. He calls them wretched inhabitants. He accuses them of all kinds of nasty stuff, thinks they're just, depraved. Um, Pufendorf doesn't think that at all. Pufendorf seems to hold those people in high esteem, actually, if I'm reading him right. And furthermore, he says, look, we're already fighting, okay, over tragedy of the commons. We have tragedy of the commons with weapons, okay? We've been doing this since forever. Like, forget whatever Locke's saying about, going out and finding land in the Americas. Just look out the window, man. That's what he's saying. He doesn't, Pufendorf didn't read Locke, didn't need to, didn't care about Locke. Now the reverse wasn't true. Locke read Pufendorf for sure, respected him highly, didn't dare mention him by name. All right, what I put here. The impulse to form settled societies is natural. It's just not universal. Yeah, right. Some people remain as hunter gatherers. It only occurs when certain conditions are met. Otherwise, we might remain as hunter gatherers. So, humans have this kind of innate instinct to form societies, maybe the way that, a spider might have an instinct to build a web, okay? But, there's some spiders that can build webs but choose not to, or they use them different. It's if you actually look into like the evolution of web spinning of spiders, it looks like spiders like lost the ability. Some spiders lost the ability, then regained it, lost it, regained it. um, and they can be in different stages of having the ability to do it. And so Locke here is kind of, I'm sorry, Pufendorf here is just saying that people all have this sort of innate ability to form states, but they don't. It's only triggered. The impulse to do it is only triggered under certain circumstances. Now, I put in the margins here that Pufendorf doesn't care what Genesis says. Pufendorf doesn't care what Genesis says. That's how I read these sections here. Pufendorf knew he had to deal with readers who are like Locke and Filmer, who took Genesis literally. And he just needs to put the stake and all that crap. And I think that's what he's doing in this page. You can go back and read it for yourself and see what you think. All right. Now, he thinks that what really happened in the beginning was that humans just went off into the woods and had families, like I said here, okay? And he thinks that's all that happened in the beginning was people, whenever hominids, were walking around the earth, they were just having families, all right? Here I put, I don't know how the hell Pufendorf knew, that these portions of the Odyssey took place in Sicily, because I've read, that modern historians have gone back and figured that out. But in any case, Pufendorf is at once, I guess, not saying so nice things about Sicilians, because he's saying, they live like, crazy animals, I guess, when you read about them in the Odyssey. But he says, nevertheless, they still had families, like they still, even the most wretched creatures. And no, he doesn't care about the Bible. He's talking about Homer here. All right. Now he says, look, sometimes you get a bunch of families living in the area and they just kind of like get to know each other, and they just start meeting and, they just, whatever, they form a little neighborhood society, whatever, that happens just kind of sometimes. And he thinks, all right, now he skips ahead a little bit here, okay? Talks about states. He talks about when we become elegant here, okay? He says, um, if you look at, well, let's just see if we can get a. Let's see if I can get this working here. See what this guy actually looked like. I mean, look at these portraits, okay? All this crazy, these people had to wear these crazy wigs, all these designs and everything. It's got to be all fancy. Everything's got to be in, Latin, even though he's German. Whatever, that kind of, let's call that elegance, okay? That's not happening in like these hunter-gatherer societies. That doesn't happen from people just forming like a neighborhood society. He kind of recognizes that that's some kind of a twisted perversion of like natural human tendencies. He sees, he's not, anyway, let's move on. Here he brings in Genesis to point out that hunter-gatherer societies exist. He really is trying to sell his audience on this idea that, look, you don't have to live. States aren't necessary. Okay, they're not inevitable. And he brings in Genesis here, even to point that out. He says that in Genesis they describe a time when humans were living basically like hunter-gatherers. Okay, he points out down here, I think, and I put Native Americans. He doesn't say Native Americans, but he says there are many states today which seek abroad the means to supply their needs or pleasure, yet they do not feel it necessary to combine with those with whom they trade in one state. Now, maybe he's not talking about Native Americans, but I think he was aware that there were people engaging in commerce who didn't feel the need to form states, right? And then he says, while on the other hand, there are not a few peoples that have led a civil life for many centuries, and yet they have lived with no more refinement or ease than did once the old fathers or families. So there, I think he's definitely talking about, people who might be, Native Americans or whatever, people that for many centuries lived with no more refinement or ease than, people, lived in our part of the world, you know, um, in the earliest times. Okay. Um, so anyway, he cites this Roman author here. Nor do I care for your walls, I who live a free man on the northern plains. I own, I carry with me. My wagon is my only care, my only loss, nor will you hold it long as spoil. My banquet is any domesticated or wild animal. Okay, so he's saying there were these people, there are people out there who don't feel the need to have a state. They can have all their needs met and they can get all the socialization and all the enjoyment they want out of life without having a state. Now, he also points this out. He's right. He's absolutely right. Before we formed states, we formed big cities. Like if you actually go and look at the earliest, um, settled areas, they really are seem to be cities, and then really the earliest cities like Samarkand, it's hard to do archaeology in some of these places today. It's complicated, but that's an example, Samarkand, of one of the very earliest cities. Okay, it looks like that city was established before um, anyone decided to put down roots and build settled civilizations, out of any of the various peoples that might have passed through Samarkand as that city was emerging. So Pufendorf is absolutely right here. Now here's where he gets to the heart of the matter. He looks, he says, states are formed out of defensive necessity, just in environments where it was necessary to do that sort of thing for whatever reason. He's not even asking why that might happen. He's just saying, look, sometimes it's too crazy out there. People for whatever reason, they need to form these states, in order to protect themselves. It's a defensive necessity. Okay. Earlier he was saying, do we do this because out of need or out of glory? And here he's saying it's out of need, and it's out of need for one thing: protection, defense. Now, here he acknowledges that states allow us to produce surplus, and I put no need to read Locke. Pufendorf tells it all to you in purple here. Forget Locke. That's right. He's saying, look, you know, just because states were formed for this reason doesn't mean that they don't also have other effects. Okay? He says we form them on a defensive necessity, but then after we form them, we start to notice these other things like, that the state allows us to produce surplus goods. And remember, up earlier, he said that, humans are the only animals that go to war over superfluous things. Okay. Um, Only humans go to war over superfluous things. He said up there on page 6. And now we're down here. I skipped ahead too far. All right. Now he's saying down here that states allow the production of all those superfluous things. And remember, states allow that kind of elegance, right? And they also allow people to seek glory and obtain glory, right? We talked about that earlier, right? So states begin to facilitate all these things, but that doesn't mean that that's the reason why we created them. He's saying the reason why we created them was defensive necessity. I put awesome if true. What does he say? Oh, he says that, the Persians had a custom, at least according to, somebody here, you know, again, I need to look this up, see what this stuff says, because this is great stuff. After the king died, they'd go 5 days without any law, so as to learn by actual experience how great a calamity lawlessness is, which brings with it murder, thievery, and anything else that is worse. And this is done in order that they may be more faithful guards of their kings. Okay. I could expand on that and talk a little bit more about some modern analogs to that, but that's really neat that Pufendorf was thinking along these lines. Now, here he hits on something that really, really seems to ring true with our modern understanding of how humans think. Okay. Um, Again, he says we have it's defensive necessity, and he said that cause us to form states, and he says that manifests as fear. Okay, we're not rationally thinking defensive necessity, we're just fearful. And he says, you know we seem to have, he cites somebody talking about birds. Okay, to say Foresight brings us safety, okay? Foresight, like anticipating that somebody's going to attack you, even if you don't know. Just imagining, all these things that could go wrong, okay? He says that we are like our bird brains, I guess, make us fearful, right? And here I summarize him as saying that we live in states for the same reason. We live in houses with locked doors, just scared. And I interpret him down here to be saying that when you're afraid of something, the first thing you do is try to make the fear go away. When you're afraid of the dark, the first thing you do is try to turn on a light. When you're sick, you take medicine to cure the disease. Okay? You just try to get rid of the source of your fear. So Pufendorf is saying, look, humans are just fearful. Let's even if you think that they don't need to form states because it's not so bad out there, humans just tend to be fearful. We just have these bird brains. And he says, look, some of it is rational too. He says, in the state of nature, okay, going back to tragedy of the commons, okay, we have to be worried about the people that would just take all the apples for themselves, the people who would just come and take our food. It's not just that we're worried about all the random, sick, twisted people out there. We're worried about the people who make the rational calculation to come and take all the food for themselves. We're worried about those people coming and using weapons to take the apples out of our hands. And he cites Genesis again. See, he's I mean, there's no need to read Locke here. He's putting this just putting the stake in Locke. All right, I put this lines up with archaeology as we know in the 21st century. What does he say here? Um, yeah, I mean that like Hornius goes on to say to attack others with curses and weapons would have been the work not only of a scoundrel but a fool, for the persons thus attacked could properly slay the assailant. No booty could have been expected of poor men. Yeah, right. In other words, maraudings and thievery, okay, seem to have begun in concert with the first times when people began um, cultivating the land or raising flocks of domesticated animals. In other words, they really, it's like a chicken and egg thing, okay? I think a lot of this just comes out of like history that people have done of steppe nomads. Okay, they've said that people there were nomads living on the steppes for centuries, um, but none of them thought to form armies of horse archers until there were settled societies for them to raid, maybe on an annual basis. And it seems like Egypt also functioned on this kind on this kind of economy for a long time, where you do annual raids on on other societies and steal their food, that kind of thing. Um, Pufendorf is saying he I think you know he's reasoning backward in time, and he has to imagine what happened. He didn't have archaeology to back him up, but his imagination of things here is very close, I think, to what archaeology tells us here. Pufendorf again, I'd say really somebody who I think I'd get along with a lot better than John Locke. Um, here he's saying that when people form states, you know, they do all kinds of crazy things. It's against the law of nature, okay? Now, here he talks about people being fearful again, okay? Foresight. Remember, he mentioned foresight when he was talking about birds. If a man has anticipated his enemy and killing him because of an uncertain fear which he could easily have escaped from, it must by no means be held that his deed is permitted by nature. He's talking about, people who have an irrational fear of like, communism spreading to America if we don't go over to this country in Southeast Asia and uh, send 500,000 Americans over there to go kill millions of people, Pufendorf saw the insanity of that. Okay, he saw the insanity, and he saw that it was something that only that the formation of states facilitates. Okay, enables, encourages. Okay, it doesn't happen when people just it doesn't hunter gatherers don't do that kind of thing. He's saying. Um, Now he says, and I put horniest has cause and effect backwards. It's a fatuous statement of his. However much hatred and distrust there may be between men, still they will not be said to occur for the sake of a state. Um, I think, yeah, what Pufendorf is saying is that humans have a natural distrust of each other, and that's what causes them to form states. It's dislike of each other, fear of each other. He says here, for men did not hate and distrust each other in order that they might establish states, but they established a state because they distrusted each other. So that's what he's putting there, okay? He's saying people naturally, remember earlier he was saying everybody would love to have a slave, you know? Um, but here, some people want to live off the grid. You know, Pufendorf is okay with that. Some keep their hands off their neighbor's goods from fear. They calculate that it's not easy to take what belongs to others without others taking what belongs to oneself, and so they prefer to neither take nor give. Right? Just people who just want to live off the land, don't want to take anything from anyone, and they're also not, trying to give away anything to anyone. And Pufendorf says, you know what, that's fine. If everyone lived like that, that'd be fine. But, there's some real twisted people out there. And he says, opposed to these is a great mass who would hold every sacred thing vile, okay? Whenever hope of gain entices them, okay? That's just a fact. There's some sick people out there that you got to deal with. And he says it is wisdom to guard against wicked men and to place about oneself suitable guards. Okay. So really, this just is a fantasy. You can't live like that. Okay. It says down here, everybody would commit crimes if they could get away with it. That's how I interpret him. He's reading Plato, but he says, wherever anyone thinks he can safely be unjust, there he is unjust. Okay. That's what he's saying. All right. Now here I say Locke said the same thing. Oh yeah, here he's saying that the state of nature exists between governments. Okay, that really, if you want to look for, you don't have to look back in time to see humans behaving in a state of nature. Just look at how states act with respect to each other. They act, violent. They act threatening. They try to dominate one another. They compete for resources. He's saying that's how humans are still acting at the state level. They're still acting like these psychos, I mean, all right. Here, he's just getting rid of the idea that you can just have courts and laws that are going to secure the peace, because that they're not self-enforcing. They're not self-enforcing. Somebody's got to come along and enforce the laws. All right. It's making it, look, he doesn't waste any time. He just cuts right to the chase. I should just leave that page sit there so you can read it because he says so much. We can have the most faith in governments that make it a loss for parties to withdraw from the compact. Yeah, right. So people are forming a state for defensive purposes, okay? But then, along with those defensive purposes, along with those defensive needs, after those defensive needs are met, you get all this sick stuff that Pufendorf is just telling us about, the production of all these surplus goods and the attachment that people form to these superfluous things and the weird passions that people develop, these political passions, and the way that it sends them off to war, and behave like idiots. Okay. He says that, all these governments are basically idiotic. Okay. We have to choose, the least idiotic government. So pick the one that you least hate to withdraw from. Okay. Pick the government, like they're all basically, we've agreed that any state is better than just being left to ourselves. That's why we form the state, out of fear. Okay. So given that, our fears are met, just look at, how much better off we are versus what we'd have to deal with if we were just back, left to ourselves out in the woods. Okay. Stick with the government that offers us the best deal in comparison, right? I put here in the margins, Locke thought reputational effects were enough to facilitate contracts in state of nature. And I must have said that because, well, first of all, I think Locke's wrong. And I guess Pufendorf addresses that here. Yeah, he says, everyone likes to be believed. Okay, we get reputational effects. Yeah, yeah, okay. But in natural state, it will be much safer course to think upon the old saying, the man who believed lost his property, the man who disbelieved kept his. So he's saying, look, that's not enough to overcome the natural distrust. Whatever warm fuzzies you get from staying good, honest to your word, that John Locke is saying will get us through in the state of nature. Pufendorf says it's overcome by the bird brain fear that we have, the natural mistrust that we have of each other, and also the rationally justified mistrust that we have of each other. He says he thinks it's rational for us to be fearful in the state of nature. Now, down here, he points out that in order to run a state that people don't want to withdraw from, up here he says, find a state that, the state that sucks the least. Okay. Now he's saying, look, in order to build a state, that sucks the least, really requires a lot of wisdom and expertise. Okay. And he's like, look, most people just are not up to the task, okay? The majority are led by the violence of their passions, wherever their lust or a false idea or their advantage may take them, okay? He's like, it's just really tough to find anyone who's up to the task of good governance. And he says, here, I put in the margins, people who seem to disagree about everything nonetheless agree to become bound by governments. What do they all have in common? I don't know what I was thinking there. I must have thought they all must have some kind of fear, some mutual fear that binds them together. I wrote down here, I wrote these notes, I should say, several days apart, so I'm not sure exactly what I was thinking when I wrote some of these notes. Most decisions people make are based on impulse, not deliberation. That's how I interpret what he's saying here. I think modern psychology has borne that out. It says right here, the mass of men order their lives not by reason, but on impulse. Yeah, I put here, if Christians were rational, they would fear God's punishment more than the punishment of men, but they seem to fear punishment of men more. Locke was wrestling with this too. Locke was trying to figure out, why human beings aren't suicidal given their short lifespans. He couldn't figure it out, okay, because he thought, well, we're only here for 70, 80 years, and that's not much time in the grand scheme of things. Well, Pufendorf doesn't necessarily, believe in eternity or whatever. Okay. So, he's saying, hey, whatever these Christians believe, they ain't acting like it. Okay. They still act like they're, you know, they could say whatever they want about fearing God's punishment, but it seems, the way they behave is more like they fear, the cops. Okay. Just in their day-to-day behavior. Okay. So he's not buying any of it. Look who he's citing here. Julius Caesar, the Gallic Wars. Like, what the hell? All right. Um, Great wealth is typically held unfairly by the unjust. I mean, he's pointing that out here. He's like, he says when you form these states, you start cranking out all this wealth, and by the way, it gets distributed unfairly. He's just saying that's what happens. Remember, he's saying it's because of fear. It's just our bird brains make us do this, and it has all these crazy effects. Screws up the Gini effect or whatever. You end up with oligarchs and monopolies and stuff. Says we tend to feel more guilty after we commit a crime than before we commit it. That's true. That's true. I'm not even sure in what context he's bringing that up here, but I'm telling you, he's so dense. I mean, he crams so much into these 18 pages. This is, look, page 966, a much longer work here. Okay, that's the kind of writer we're dealing with here. Put a question here, I think, because I wanted to go back and check. I wonder if Hobbes was saying that people operate on narrow time horizons. I think people do. I think it's just part of the way we evolve that it's hard for us to think in time horizons longer than 20 years at the most. Okay. And then here, Pufendorf is again saying like people are generally dumber than the states that govern them. Okay. Like, whatever natural impulse it is that leads human beings to form states, under certain circumstances. Pufendorf is saying that there's some process by which the state sorts people into determines who's fit to become part of the state, and that most people don't make the cut. Okay. Oh, that's the end. Hey, what do you know? All right. Well, hey, that's I guess my gentle introduction to Pufendorf, and we kept it to less than an hour, which is great. Uh, I don't know if whether I should go back and hit on any particular points here. There was some stuff that I kind of glossed over that I wanted to cover. Oh yeah, it's really about political parties and party affiliation. There's something up here he says that I think is very profound, and I don't think I put it in the notes. He says it early on. I think I'll be able to find it. I think I'll be able to find it. It's pretty early. I'm going to pause the video until I find it. Okay, we're back. And it's that section on false display of externals. Like I said, Pufendorf, I said at the outset, he really tiptoes you into things. He starts off by telling you about, somebody telling jokes. He talks about professional comedians here, people with the profession of amusing. All right. He starts you off easy, and then by the time you get to the end, he's talking about all kind of war and violence and all this terrible stuff, unfairness and justice. Okay. But back up here at the beginning, he was talking about false display of externals. Okay, which I thought was really interesting. He says those who are united by reason of a service for the state form a kind of party friendship. Now he's writing this in like the 1650s, I think, maybe earlier, or maybe a little bit later. I don't know, but he wrote so much, had a crazy life, but certainly he was writing before the U.S. was formed, so there were no constitutional republics in his age. But really, what he's saying was true when the U.S. was formed. That there was kind of a political party that was formed, the Federalists. When they wrote letters to the people of New York, these people who were at the time called anti-federalists, who were opposed to creating this United States government. Okay, so the impulse to create the impulse to create a government um, was carried out by a political party that formed before the government formed. Okay, in the United States, that's an actual fact. Now, Pufendorf here is saying that that's the way all states form. That there's a kind of party friendship. Okay, now he calls it a party friendship here, but look at what he's saying. He's telling us right at the outset, savors more of mutual fear than love. Okay, now I think what he's saying here, you could put the word political party in here and say and that everything he says here is true. That what political parties tend to pitch above all else is fear of the other party, fear of the other party taking power. Okay, no one really loves a political party. No one really feels true devotion or love to a political party. They may feel loyalty to a political party. They may feel intense loyalty to a political party, but Pufendorf is saying that loyalty is motivated primarily by fear of the other parties or the opposition, your perceived opposition. And he doesn't even say the fear has to be legitimate. He's saying that this fear can be totally irrational. Okay, it can be, or it may be not totally irrational. It may be rational to some extent, but there's also an extent to which our bird brains take over. And furthermore, he suggests in this in this 18-page passage that like he said, there are people, not many people are fit to lead, not many people. Now you might think he's saying he's being an elitist there, and he's saying that we need to find the select few who are fit to be kings and make them kings. Okay, but what he also says throughout this passage is that the people who form these states, okay, tend to be ambitious. They tend to be driven by ambition. And he also says that every person tends to put their own interest first. He leads off by telling us that. He says, everyone agrees that for whatever reason people form states, it's always out of self interest. Okay. Hobbes says it. These Greeks say it. He starts off by saying, I just put in the margins, Pufendorf owned a lot of books. But what he's saying in these early passages is that people do everything out of self interest. Even this laughter is done out of self interest. And so he does talk about glory here, okay? And I was saying that's kind of weird, but think about it. You have people who are fearful, okay? Fearful, rationally to some extent, but they have that bird brain instinct kicking in. And so they're going to run. They're going to hide inside those city walls. He's got a passage down here about city walls or something taken from an ancient Roman author. He says the people are going to run to somebody, but who are they going to run to? Well, the person who offers the best deal, okay? But, I mean, how do you advertise that you offer the best deal? Maybe glory is how you do that. Maybe what they end up doing is running to the leader who displays the most glory, okay? Pufendorf nowhere here is giving credit to any government or making any government look good or sane at all, okay? Pufendorf here is saying that governments, we have a natural tendency to form governments, okay? But we also have natural tendencies to be selfish and to have all kinds of insane desires that drive us in directions that make us, lower than the lowest of animals in the jungle, okay? So Pufendorf has this low opinion of men, and he thinks that it becomes expressed at an even higher level when we form states, okay? And that we become ingrained to these states and we bring our children into these states, and that we're all doing it out of fear, fear, fear. And whatever the state is doing at any given time, can't make sense of it. You can observe its effects. Okay, you can observe that it has these perverse effects. Like, where can we find perverse effects? Um, Well, the perverse effects where it's producing surplus, okay, and wealth is being distributed unequally, okay. I was looking for that part here where he says wealth is distributed unequally. But these kinds of perverse effects, like the Vietnam War, that only happens when we start to form states, okay. So Pufendorf has, I think, a very a negative view of states, but also I think a very kind view towards uh, humanity in general. I think he's much more of a humanist than Locke. And really, you have to wonder how he viewed himself as he was writing this book, because I'll finish by saying that he sorts people into, he says people are always trying to gain an edge over one another, even when they're making jokes. They're still making a joke at someone else's expense. And he says that this happens even in learned societies down here. Yeah, these learned men, okay. I'll end by saying that, Pufendorf, when he was writing this book, must have understood that he was participating in this. Okay. And what were his motives, to write this kind of stuff? Because he's taking all these people down a peg and he's showing their inhumanity. Um, it seems like he's trying to show, he's putting on a display of humanity, okay, that's supposed to stand in contrast to what all these other people, most lowest members of society and the highest members of society, are all behaving in this brutish manner. And he's describing it. Does he think that he's better than those people because he can stand outside it and describe it? Or, does he see himself participating in it? I don't know. But anyway, I'm going to end the video now so I can say that I kept it under an hour. This is the regular guy signing off.